1920s documentary. Many people believe that the 1920s marked a new era by Mireya Reyes. Palmer Raids. Palmer Raids, also called Palmer Red Raids, they were conducted by the U.S. Department of Justice in 1919 and 1920 in an attempt to arrest foreign anarchists and communists, many of whom were subsequently deported. Red Scare. The Red Scare was the fear of communist revolution which held America. The first Red Scare occurred immediately after World War I, revolved around a perceived threat from the American labor movement. Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti were charged with the crime of a bump-off on May 5, 1920, and indicted 4 months later on September 14th. Anarchists in the U.S. and abroad began a campaign of violent rehabilitation. Great Migration. The Great Migration was the mass movement of about 5 million Southern blacks to the North and West. There was a remarkable increase in the African American population of the North that was a major effect of the Great Migration, but once black Southerners arrived, they found reality didn't often parallel their optimistic expectations. Flappers. During the 1920s, flapper was the name for young women who dressed much more open with themselves. Flappers were famous or infamous depending on your viewpoint for their rakish attire. Flappers were known for their energetic freedom, embracing a lifestyle viewed by many at the time as outrageous. They're considered as the first generations of independent American women. They also pushed barriers in economic, political, and freedom for women. People describe flappers as having bob hairstyles and wearing thick makeup. Urban culture. The Roaring Twenties were a period in history of dramatic social and political change. For the first time, more Americans lived in cities than on farms. The urban lifestyle brought new ways of living and new cultures to America. Prohibition. Nationwide prohibition lasted from 1920 until 1933. The 18th Amendment was to illegalize the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcohol that was passed by the U.S. Congress in 1917. As a result, the Prohibition era also is remembered as a period of gangsterism characterized by competition and violent turf, battles between criminal gangs. The Prohibition gangsters were mobsters and bootleggers who profited from the illegal sale of liquor during the Prohibition era. Until 1920, mobsters and the mafia had mainly limited their activities to prostitution, extortion, gambling, and theft. Gangsters. Al Capone was one of the most famous gangsters during the Roaring Twenties. Born in Williamsburg, Brooklyn in 1899 to immigrant parents, Capone was recruited by a member of the 5 Points gang in early 1920s. Alphonse Gabriel Capone, sometimes known by the nickname Scarface, was an American gangster and businessman who attained notoriety during the Prohibition era as the co-founder and boss of the Chicago outfit. His 7-year reign as a crime boss ended when he went to prison at age 33. Movies. During the 1920s, movies had been established as a big business. With Hollywood being the center for most of the activity, movies changed the way the Americans used their free time. Millions of people began going to movie theaters throughout the country. On 1927, the road of the silent movie began to disappear with the New York release of the first talkie, The Jazz Singer. The plot of this film, which started Al Jolson, told an individual American story of the 1920s. It followed the life of a Jewish man from his boyhood, days of being groomed to be the cantor at the local synagogue, to his life as famous and Americanized jazz singer. Both the story and the new sound technology used to present it were popular with audiences around the country and quickly became a huge hit. Radio. The radio was certainly one of the most important inventions of the 1920s because it did not only bring the nation together, but it brought a whole new way for people to communicate and interact. After being introduced during the World War I, radios became a common feature in American homes of the 1920s. Hundreds of radio stations popped up over the course of the decade. These stations developed and broadcasted news, serial stories, and political speeches. Dance halls. The 1920s saw the rise of shimmy, the black bottom, and the charleston, while swing music was all the rage by the 1930s, and young couples were dancing the lindy, also known as the jitterbug. Dancing marathon in 1920s. Dance marathons, also called as walkathons, an American phenomenon of the 1920s and 1930s, were human endurance contests in which couples danced almost non-stop for hundreds of hours, as long as a month or two, competing for prize money. In the In these dance endurance contests, a mix of local hopefuls and seasoned professional marathoners danced, walked, shuffled, sprinted, and sometimes cracked under the pressure and exhaustion of round-the-clock motion. A 25-cent admission prize entitled audience members to watch as long as they pleased. Dance marathons were held in Seattle and Yakima and elsewhere. They occupied a slightly disrespectful hollow in society. Many towns banned them, finding them disruptive and disturbing. Pole sitting in the 1920s. Flagpole sitting was a fad in the mid to late 1920s. The fad was begun by stunt actor and former sailor Alvin Shipwreck Kelly. The main object of flagpole sitting was to see who could sit on a flagpole the longest with a diminutive platform for support. Those who sat for a long period of time were treated as heroes. Flagpole sitting all came around in 1924 when Alvin Kelly, Shipwreck, was dared to sit on top of a flagpole. Stunt pilots and aerialists, or barnstormers as they became known, performed almost any trick or feat with an airplane that people could imagine. During the 1920s, barnstorming became one of the most popular forms of entertainment. It was also the first major form of civil aviation in history of flight. Henry Ford and the assembly line. Henry Ford innovated mass production techniques that became standard. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler emerged as the big three auto companies by the 1920s. Manufacturers funneled their resources to the military during World War II. On December 1, 1913, Henry Ford installed the first moving assembly line for the mass production of an entire automobile. His innovation reduced the time it took to build a car from more than 12 hours to 2 hours and 30 minutes. The most significant piece of Ford's organized crusades was the assembly line. It was inspired by the continuous flow production methods used by flour mills, breweries, canneries, and industrial bakeries. Ford installed moving lines for bits and pieces of the manufacturing process. For instance, workers built motors and transmissions on rope and pulley-powered conveyor belts. The end.